Don't be wusses. Come sit up front. Ryan, Lackey, come in. Ryan, come on in. Okay, it's time. Should I just get started? Camera's on. Hi. Room monitor, am I introducing myself? All right, I'm introducing myself. Hi, guys, I'm Allison Miller. Thank you. Otherwise known on the Twitters as Selena Kyle, so you might recognize me by my red hair. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some things that I have been thinking about for about the last year. The title of my talk is Operating Star by the Numbers. And the reason for that actually is because I'll just tell you in advance, I'm essentially going to be making a pitch that a lot of our work is operations science applied to new technology and in new environments. So, and I also need to apologize in advance for a few things. One, trigger warning for clip art and excessive animations in PowerPoint. Just so you know ahead of time, let's just be clear. And second, I have to apologize because I actually have way too many slides and too much material for the time allotted. But there's a middle part that's pretty quantitative and there's some real data in there. And I'm going to whip through that and just ask that you trust me for a lot of that and then ask me questions about it at the end. But I thought it was really important that I put something real in here, lest you think that what I'm talking about is only theory. So basically what we're going to do is talk a little bit about how we got here. And when I say we, I actually mean me, how I got here. And because one of the things that I did semi-recently is escape security into work that is exactly like what I was doing in security. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about models because they have been ruling my life for a while. And they are key to this concept of operations research and where I think that our industry is going. Then I will show you some numbers. I will not show you any big data. I will not show you any machine learning, except for the fact that I will. I just didn't incorporate those terms into the title of my talk. So you came here of your own free will. And if you need to leave because you hear the term data science, it's okay. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe some ideas that we can beg, borrow, and steal to take back with us into our day-to-day. So how did we, I mean me, get here? Well, some of you may not know this, but actually, well, why would you? So I went to business school, actually, as an undergrad. I didn't study computer science. I studied information systems, and I also studied finance. And part of my preparation for that technical business degree was a lot of math and statistics, which I hated. I couldn't stand it, and I was so happy when I got to put this book away. And around that same time, I realized that everything was connected, smart systems, and there were all of these ideas sort of emerging about things that were going to happen with new technology, including things like the internet and how it might be used for e-commerce. And I got really jazzed by this idea that everything was connected. And then I realized, oh my gosh, everything is connected. And because I really was born to be in this industry, not just bred, I started thinking, and there are some people who are not nice who are out there in that all-connected world. In fact, there are hackers out there. Oh my goodness. So I became very interested in computer crime. The reason why I'm running through some of these books is because these were things that I read that affected my thinking, not only affected where I went in my career, but sort of how I approached solving some of the problems that I came across. So after getting an earful of all of the crimes that could be committed, the laws that were passed in the late 80s and such that are still in effect today, I thought, well, how can we, take destiny into our own hands? And so I read this book, Foreshadowing. This book was written by Anonymous. And however, I still took all of that business and finance organizational skills in as I read this book, and that is indeed color coding, and I did read the whole thing. But then I realized that was kind of overkill, and maybe there was a better way to focus on things that were higher risk and a way to channel energy. And so I came to this book, which is published by the same publishing company that published the original sort of CISSP prep guides, if any of you remember Auerbach Press. So this was their offering. And then somehow, from here to here to here, I came back to probability and statistics, which was, I said, oh, flee. I want to be more strategic. But wait, I need something more practical. No. More practical. No. Maybe a little more quantitative or useful in some way. Nope, that's definitely not it. That's not it either. Well, this is really interesting, but back to statistics we went. And practical statistics simply explain, let me tell you, it's actually not explained that simply. And so I found myself here, which was suddenly deja vu, because here I was, way out of college. And essentially what I was reading about are the tools and techniques that I learned here in operations management, in decision science, decision science, which were some of the things that I actually studied as an undergraduate. Alongside my information systems classes were operations management classes. And I didn't pay much attention in those classes because I wasn't planning on going into manufacturing. I wasn't going to be trying to optimize assembly lines. Except I have, and I'll explain a little bit about that, because you may or may not have stumbled across these types of concepts in your education, but they may be useful to you in the work that you're doing now. So back to information risk analysis, because that's actually kind of what I'm known for. The fraud analytics and some of the risk work that I did when I was at Visa, for example. And the reason why I want to show this to you is because, I don't know if you can read this, but what I did is I looked up the word quantitative. And the word quantitative, I believe, appears twice, and they may both be on this page. And basically what it says is, the pros of qualitative are that people will understand it, and you can get lots of people involved, and you can express the results in management-specific language. And quantitative is really hard. And it requires a lot of data and sophisticated statistical tools and techniques that the average layperson doesn't necessarily have, and they're not necessarily going to understand your results. So this book was published over 10 years ago, and I have been hearing a lot in listening to folks who are doing technical security and how they want to harness things like big data and machine learning, and these are the exact type things that they are stumbling into now. These ideas that it's hard, and it requires these special techniques, and that it's difficult. So, and those are all true, but that meant that risk professionals were left taking approaches like this, because this is what the rest of the book was, which was, all right, let's just go figure it out in a qualitative way, because that will be easier. However, while I sort of make fun of that book, I did take something from it that I think is very important, which is there are really no such things as security requirements. There are only business requirements. And when security requirements get ignored, it's because they're not expressed in a way that is compelling to the business, that can be prioritized alongside other business requirements. And that is something that stuck with me. The other thing that stuck with me is risk analysis is part of a quality assurance program. And I kind of bristle at that. I bristle at the idea that we're doing as quality assurance. You know why? Because quality sounds a lot like operations management. It sounds like Kaizen, it sounds like Six Sigma, it sounds like all of these topics that I kind of think that we're a little more special than that. However, there's been a lot of work and research that has been put into how to make operations management manageable, and so that part appeals to me. So in going back and looking at the notes that I took in my operations management textbook, here's some things that popped out at me. One is, forecasting is the art and science of predicting future events. Predictive models, forecasting models and predictive models are sort of the same breed. And I also think it's awesome how if you're doing something like a risk analysis, a lot of times you get challenged. Oh, you think you know what's going to happen in the future? You're gonna take a swag at that? Are you a fortune teller? No, but I'm gonna forecast some likely events, and I may even be able to tell you the likelihood. And what I like here is that they don't back down. Forecasting is the art and science of predicting future events. They go out, they say, we're going to predict. They also say there's no universal forecasting method. There's no one way. The way you figure out how you're going to build your forecasting model depends a lot on what you're trying to forecast. And they'll almost always be wrong. Their point is to reduce variance, not to make perfect predictions in the way that they are actually implemented at most businesses. And here's another note that I took. See, it says, this is when you're selecting a forecasting method, how sophisticated are the folks who are going to be using this, consuming the results of it? That matters because, generally speaking, managers, and let's just call them people, generally speaking, people are reluctant to use results from techniques they do not understand. And as a security person, that really resonated with me. There are people who are really resistant to do things that they don't understand. It's true in security, it's true in risk, and it's true in modeling operations everywhere. Okay, so now back to me, because it's all about me. My background is in security and also risk and fraud analytics, and now operations. And in the past few years, if you'd ask me about what my work was, I would explain I live life at layer 8. So for things like fraud prevention, I assume, and I know what they say about making assumptions, but I assume the code is good, and that what I need to do is I need to predict whether the person making a transaction, let's say, or logging in, let's say, or sending an email, let's say, is good or bad. That's really different than trying to figure out if there's a bug or flaw somewhere in your system. So I assume the code is good, and yet there's still a sea of potential bad out there for me to go get my hands around. Oh yeah, sorry, I had a really awesome animation here. Let's just take a moment while it's building. So that brings me to what I believe operations is, which is the process of transforming inputs into outputs. And so that doesn't necessarily need to be a manufacturing concept. Can you read that? Okay, yes you can. It's just weird on the screen. Okay, get a few giggles. Thank you very much. Thank you. There's more. Don't worry, I got more. Okay, so as I said, I've been doing security for a little while, but the last few years, the last few years have been really interesting because of all of these different technologies and techniques that have come onto the scene, both that we are expected to secure and incorporate into how we do our work, but also things that could help us. So, big data. On the one hand, well, that's a lot of data and a lot of complexity to then try and wrap protections around. On the other hand, big data, we're also, thinking about how we may use that to protect ourselves. So as I think about some of these things that are sort of hot right now, I also have to laugh and recognize that a lot of this is really just old school. So all of these things related to data and analytics and machine learning and predictive algorithms and all of that, to me, that's actually just a recasting of research techniques. And specifically, since they're applied in practical environments as opposed to experimental environments, it's operations research, which used to be called management science, if you could imagine that there is a science of management, or decision science, which is something that I actually studied. And then a lot of something like DevOps, for example, is essentially it's agile, but it's really a quality program, like TQM or Kaizen, or those types of things, but applied to software, applied to services in really highly scaled out platforms, things start to get really interesting. So, and the reason why you should care is because both the new technologies, is there a build here? No, okay. I get lost in my build. So the reason why you should care is because these things really are relevant to how you're designing your control systems if you're a builder. May also be relevant to you if you're a breaker, if you're the type who likes to automate your stuff. Because the tools that essentially one uses to manage systems and to put control systems around them in order to make their lives easier is going to incorporate automation. And when you have automation, you also usually have some sort of problem that you're optimizing around, because when you're automating, you don't have a human in the mix, so you have to sort of pick the point, pick your targets, and then manage to them. And so modeling is essentially an operations tool. And what is a model? Well, a model is an imitation of the real thing. It can be an environment in which things are tested, are approximated. It can be a projection. Models can mean a lot of different things, and we use them in a lot of different concepts, everywhere from design, when we're trying to figure out how something should work, to trying to understand how it is working when you actually have a system that you've instrumented, and then you are trying to determine how prod is working. So one book that I read recently, I highly recommend it if you are into modeling, is Combat Modeling, which is by Alan Washburn and Moshe Kresh. It's awesome, and one of the things they talk about, like developing ballistic models and how to do threat modeling for things like terrorism and stuff. It's an awesome book. One of the things that I really liked is they took a bunch of different types of models and put them on this scale from abstract to realistic. So some of the modeling techniques that I've seen used, like logistic regression or statistical-based ones, or these some of the advanced machine learning, those are actually sort of put on the abstract side, whereas the realer models are the ones that incorporate people, like wargaming and doing simulations of that nature. The thing that I think is sort of funny, though, is that it's the abstract models. Okay, it's the abstract models that are actually prescriptive versus descriptive. It just kind of makes me wonder, because it is just a thought. I mean, it's totally true, but this idea that if something's abstract, you would think that it would be the one that is descriptive, and the one that is more realistic would be the one that would be prescriptive. But actually, and I understand why, actually, because the machine-driven tools can be automated, allows them to be employed in prescriptive ways, where the realistic models are more like people practicing, and they describe situations that could happen. Which brings us to quality, measuring quality, understanding quality. So Deming, who's kind of a big deal in this field, quality cannot be improved by trying harder, which I really love. And something to consider. It's not just about doing things better. It's often about doing things differently. Speaking of models and doing things differently, here is a threat model that I presented, I think, here a couple of years ago, or, well, at least in Mountain View. And this is essentially what I'm describing here is what it's like to be a platform, in the sense that you have users, you may have integrations to other service providers, and over time what we've seen is actually, well, first of all, you have all of these different threats that are threatening not just you and your core system, the mothership, but also all of the things connected into you. And since my life is spent dealing with things like account takeover and fraud and spam, these are things that affect users who are using the platform, rather than necessarily something that infests or attacks the core of the platform itself. But in looking at this, if this is a system that I'm meant to operate, this is a terrible system. First of all, it looks like a bullseye. And second of all, well, right, it does, doesn't it? And second of all, it doesn't actually, it doesn't convert an input into an output. You know what I mean? There's no Tai Chi there. It's just what this system, the output of this system would be is stress, because all of these attacks are just coming in. What is the waste or the byproduct that is coming out? It just feels like maybe we should be able to get there. And actually, I do have some hope, looking at some of the problems that I've been asked to solve, the user level, the layer 8 problems, that there actually is an output. We just don't always look at the whole output and recognize it as such. So this is the part where I'm going to ask you to trust me, because I'm going to go very fast. So how much time do I have left? I have 40 minutes left? That can't be right. 30. Oh, wow, I'm only 10 minutes in. Hey, we're going to have time for lots of questions. Okay, so I'm going to actually run you through what I mean when I talk about a model that is working in an operating context. It's specific. If you want to, you don't have to, but you could think of it as a fraud model. How they get developed, where you put it, how you determine how it's performing, and such and such. So here's where the rubber meets the road, because these types of automated models that run in live, in production, these are essentially operations management techniques made manifest by my will and my bare hands and a whole bunch of analysts. Okay, so the first thing here is when you're trying to build a model, you are shining a light on your system. Hold on, this build is actually important. The reason why I'm sort of describing this here is because no matter how much data you have, it can cast a bigger shadow once you start applying some intelligence to it. And when you want to build a model, for example, to detect fraud, or it can be any other sort of unit-based attack, you have data. Let's assume it's logs. And these logs are telling you things about events. They're describing events. In order to build a model, the first thing that you will need to do is you will need to classify those events yourself, probably, into things that are good, things that are bad, and things that are indeterminate. So you don't need to raise your hand, but I just want you to think for a moment about your work and how much of your attention you spent to classifying good. You probably spent a lot of time identifying and classifying bad, but you don't necessarily differentiate it from good. And that's one of the places where these techniques can get really interesting if you do take that time to do that. Okay. Oh, there they go. Okay. Yes, so we split them into good, bad, and indeterminate. Okay, and the truth is that you don't need to do it all by hand, because I know you're all thinking who has enough time to do that? You can do it by logic, especially if you have some kind of feedback loop that ends up telling you whether or not something was good or bad. For example, you may have users that put email messages into a spam box. And then it actually was a human disposition, but you use some logic to figure out which of those bad emails were excessive advertisements versus actual spam, let's just say. And you want to make sure that whether you do this manually or whether you do it with logic, you want to be very crisp. You want only goods in your good population, only bads in your bad population, and then everything else goes to indeterminate. And the reason why is because you'll skew your model if you have things improperly classified while you're still building it. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that. Oh, yeah, there was something else I want to say. The other thing is that you don't have to classify all of your logs. You actually may want to use sampling, which is another research technique that is used in operations management. Pulling a sample and then classifying a sample and building your model off of a sample. It has to be large enough, but that is also, of course, something that works. So, and then we're actually going to want to implement something automated, because it's all fun and good to classify things as you're building a model, but you don't want to end up doing it forever. So that's why you actually build models that have automation. And this is generally what they look like. This is what I'm going to show here is probably similar. It's similar to a detection system in the sense that someone is attempting an action, and then you have a moment in time where you can make a decision about it, or you can think about it, and a result action occurs. So, and there are steps in the software. What is the request? And then the stop to think about it. How should it be honored? Should it be honored? And then your users just go on through the system. So think of it as a choke point, or like sometimes I think I like to use firewall analogies, because everybody gets that for a firewall, you're routing all of your traffic through a choke point so that you have a chance to apply a policy to it. And that's essentially how these types of risk models work. You put them places where you're going to funnel a bunch of stuff through and is a good time to make a decision. And actually, just a point on that, since I don't think I make it later, you might want your choke point to actually be different than your action point. You might actually want to think before you have to take action. And that way you can, in some cases, you'll want to know early what you think of an event, but then you don't necessarily want to show your hand until something else is attempted, if that kind of makes sense. If not, ask me about it later. I'll tell you what I mean. Now, any place that you put some kind of decisioning system in place, then you actually have the opportunity to figure out how much it all is going to cost you. Because on the one hand, you're going to have false positives where a good user gets blocked incorrectly, and then on the other, you may actually have false negatives. That will be your residual exposure to fraud, spam, account takeover, malware, data exfiltration, whatever. And in most cases, that's where you bear your cost. When you make the right decision, there's usually not much cost, except in cases where there's some downstream impact. Even though you're making the right decision, there's still a cost somewhere. So an example of this would be something like if you correctly determine that an account had been compromised, the downstream issue is you're going to have to maybe put some limits on that account and figure out how to grant the account holder access to their account again. So that's an impact. There's going to be a cost both to you and your user. So, but still, it's usually a lower cost than letting a compromised account do sensitive things. And so you're going to still want to take action. And there's a lot of, I talk about fraud and account takeover, but there's all kinds of populations besides users or transactions that could be relevant. And then as far as your own strategy, there are many different actions you might want to take in addition to blocking something. For example, step-up authentication. And then the costs are various. When it's something financial, it's usually quite clear because you're talking about money, and it's easy to convert money into money, unless it's Bitcoin, but whatever. However, obviously some things like data leakage is a little hard to then turn back into money, but it is a cost that you can look to. And so how this then gets implemented in the real world is that as a user comes through, you have, let's say you have a whole bunch of models actually running in your choke point, and you make some sort of determination, and then based on the risk of the action, you offer them these different flows or paths. And the most obvious ones would be let them go along and do what they were attempting, and the other obvious one is don't let them do whatever it is that they're attempting, but there's things that can be done in between. And clever implementers have thought of them. Flavors of risk model. Most of us end up learning very quickly algorithms and heuristics that summarize known bad patterns. That's kind of where our eyes tend to focus. But another way to go is to also notice that something deviates from a normal or good pattern. That, by the way, requires you know what good looks like. So you would have been helped out had you actually gone through and done some classification of events to identify good events. But that is, it's not trivial, I won't lie, but it's very important. So where does the whole machine learning and statistics part come in? It comes in now, in that you have a target that you're going to build your model towards. This is essentially a hypothesis. What I'm actually describing here is hypothesis testing, basic statistics. But you find a target, and then you pull data, and you create variables. I'm going to talk about that in my sec because that's my favorite part. And then you do data prep, model training. You figure out how well it's working, and then you determine what your expectations are for performance, and then you push it live, and then you hope and pray. So an example of variable creation, because I think this is fairly critical, is that you can have, this, by the way, is where data goes from data to big data in some systems, in the sense that many systems have lots of rows, like lots of users or lots of events, and that is one way for your data to get big. Another way for your data to get big is get big horizontally, meaning for every event you capture a lot of different data. And variable creation usually is synthesis of data into more interesting data or variables. So a quick example of something that you might, a decision that a model might make is, here comes a user who's coming from an IP address in a country that doesn't match the one that their credit card is in, and they're buying prepaid mobile phones, and as they're in checkout, they've added a new shipping address in the cart. However, the buyer, we know that from having them filled out their account details that they're a phone reseller, and although they're coming in from a new IP, they're coming in from a static device ID. So, I mean, if this was you, if you were the risk model, what would you do? And so part of the answer is, well, if you were the risk model, if you were a human, you would be able to figure that out just by looking at the record. But if you're a computer, there's all kinds of different additional data that would need to be appended to the record for you to understand the scenario like we just talked about it, like we just described it. So all of these things need to be tracked. And then there's things, and then in addition to things like matching with files so that you can go from an IP address to understand what country it's in, you may also have things like you need to be able to have the ability to compare addresses and a flag that says this is a new one, or this doesn't match any other shipping addresses that are currently in the account, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, by the way, how your tables for doing these models end up becoming extraordinarily wide, because the data in the logs is just not descriptive enough. It just doesn't tell the story. So once you have pulled a bunch of variables that you think might be useful, and probably in there some that you don't think are, but hey, why should you do the work of figuring it out? Let's have an algorithm do it. Let's get some machine learning on. So here are some ones that are commonly used in automated risk modeling, which are statistical methods like regression, linear logistic regression, Bayesian networks, and neural nets. I can't help it. I just don't like the Bayesian networks. They're good in some cases, but my heart is with logistic regression. So, and ultimately, though, it doesn't really matter which algorithm you use. I mean, you need to pick an algorithm that'll work for the problem you're trying to solve, but other than that, bake them off. Pit them against each other into an algorithm death match, and so you pick out the one that works the best. That, by the way, is also fun. And then this is the code. So I don't drop ODE, but I could drop a little statistics code, and this is what it looks like. Logistic, dependent variable, and then list out all of the variables that you just created, and they could be in the hundreds, which is why then you would need a big old computer system to process that. And so down here is actually what that then looks like here. You choose an algorithm. This one was using a stepwise logistic algorithm, and then so logistic, and then our dependent variable is bad is true. That's the creative name I came up with to describe it's bad. And then all these different independent variables that we want to see which ones are most useful in predicting that something is bad is true. And then this is what the output looks like. Oh my, that is crazy. So there's our dependent variable, and here are all the independent variables. And here's where we figure out if the analysis we just did has significance. If it's meaningful, you throw it out. If the p-value is too high, it's totally low, so we're good to go. And then how much of the variance in the dependent variable can be explained, or sorry, how much variance in the dependent variable can be explained by independent variables. So, and that's okay. It's not super, but it's pretty good. A little bit more. This is the whole trust me part. And then one of the reasons why I like the statistical methods as opposed to some of the more mysterious machine learning methods is that you actually can then figure out which variables were most interesting, because it will just tell you the weighting in some way. So, and this is in some cases you could just rank it by the the coefficient. But since this is logistic, there's with logarithms, there's this weird like greater than 1, less than 1 thing. So I had to convert it into an importance value. But essentially, then I'm able to go look, and this is totally fake data, by the way. I mean, it's masked, okay? So I moved some of the names around. But what this would allow you to do is understand which variables are the most indicative of that is true. And then you can use a model, but you can also maybe look into some things that show up that you weren't expecting and change your product, change how your product works too. And when it all comes together, because this isn't just about how to build a model, how to use these statistical techniques to build a model, what I also wanted to explain is then how that fits into a system that I can then operate. And the way that it works is, in my mind, basically, I've got the front end. This is where the customer interacts, and then I've got back end systems. These are actually my risk models. You know, simple things like black and white lists, but then also, you know, account linking and like internal social networks and the different data from third parties that we pull in to do different types of matching. That's my model. And then based on my models, then there are all these types of different decisions I can render that are going to then affect the front end. But it doesn't end there. Oh no. What happens is that after things occur, you know, after users have had a chance to log in, or after employees have had a chance to download active content, whatever, there's some kind of outcome that then it's stored. And then we can go back and we can understand. In the case of fraud, there's a very clear feedback loop. In other cases, it's less clear. But then you have your records of what happened, and you can then report out and figure out if it was good or bad, if your model worked the way it was supposed to, and you then use those learnings to plow them back into the risk models. And so it's like a learning system, like it never stops. Bad news is it never stops, but it's much more orderly, you know. It makes life a lot easier, because once you have this thing set up, then it's a question of optimizing, not a question of finding and continuing to build new controls. So, and for my work, this has been a better approach than relying on manual or relying simply on guesses about different rules, let's say, one might want to apply. And the way that I then prove that this is better, this is called a gains chart. And what this is telling me, this is an operations tool. So what this is telling me is, of my whole population, so the dotted line is like if I randomly guessed and picked out how much of my population would I have to decline a certain population if bad is true. So this is a dotted line, and let's just say I'm a very bad guesser. So say if I wanted to decline 100% of bad is true, I would have to decline all my population, right? Because I'm a terrible guesser. And the dotted line is also saying if I wanted to decline 50% of bad is true, then I would decline 50% of my population. How'd you like to sell that to your business owners? Yeah, not so much. But this is guessing. This is uneducated guessing. And what you want is you want a model that says, man, I only have to decline 3% of the population of attempts in order to get 90% of the bad is true. That's a good model, right? You sort of follow? And the idea is that you will have technology. Oh, I'll make that point later. It's a really good one. So when you are comparing models against each other, you just put their curves on the same chart, and the difference between them is called the gain, and that's how you know which one wins. Now, just like that, in my operations management textbook, there was a really similar to me diagram, which is related to number of defects produced to cost. And you have a cost of defects, and you have a cost of control. You have a cost associated with reducing the number of defects. See how cost is really high when you produce low defects, and then the the cost is really low if you allow all the defects through. It's kind of the same concept. And here, what is recommended in the textbook is add up the total costs and then invest where the cost is lowest, right? So that's right there. Does that kind of make sense? It's fun. It's an optimizable problem. I love that. And these are basically exactly the same things. And if you want improved performance, then oftentimes, so what you have here is you have a horizon, okay? So you can pick to live anywhere on this point. You say, hey, business, you want to decline 0% of your population? Awesome. We will catch 0% of that as true. And you say, oh, 40% declines are too high? Well, we can move down to 20%, but then we have the costs with the associated bad as true getting through. It's a really nice argument. And then what you say is, what would be better? What would be better is if we shift the whole curve. And you'd say, I need this much investment to shift the whole curve. And then, of course, business partner, you can help me pick, because I'm happy to get rid of as much bad as true as you want. It's just there's a trade-off here, and we can pick it together. Doesn't that sound nice? That conversation works sometimes. So, sometimes. So, what am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say here is what I just showed you, which is a quantitative modeling approach to solving a problem. It's used everywhere. I mean, it can be used in many contexts, and I like when it's used as part of automation, but it is also, as we just discussed, a way to sort of optimize and pick targets as far as where you need to go, and it can also help you sort of understand based on what you're building, or what the agreement is that you've developed with your stakeholders. You can sort of predict performance and manage to it, and it's used in a lot of places. So science and finance are two that jump to mind for a lot of folks, because some of those curves look like investment horizons and beta and portfolio management, but they're doing it in marketing too. So I just want you to put that in the back of your head for a moment, that if they're doing this in marketing, I feel like we should be able to do this in information technology. And furthermore, some of these principles are making their way into software development in the sort of through things like DevOps. And if you just think about how testing has evolved around maintaining quality of software, these things are sort of moving, and they're a mainstay of manufacturing and the military. So when you go back, you can remember my very entertaining way of presenting, but you could also maybe think about things like different approaches that you might be able to incorporate, like A/B testing or bake-offs, meaning testing controls against each other to figure out which one works best versus which one has different cost or bad impact in your systems, and running things off against each other to pick things that work best for whatever your own targets are. Control charts are also really nice. Understanding not just what has happened, but variants of what has happened, and being able to manage within predefined baselines. And I am actually a huge fan of what DevOps is trying to do. I think of it as just really highly engaged change management, which is something that we often don't do in security, or at least I haven't. I'm sure that all of you are way ahead of the curve compared to me, but really understanding the impact of unit changes that are made in our control environments, and being able to monitor and pull back and make changes and bob and weave as folks adjust to our control strategies. Sampling also is not a dirty word, and it can be really useful if you're trying to optimize performance. You guys already know that. Just log everything. And then, since I was reading my operations management textbooks in preparation for this talk, I did come across something that I just want to share with you because it's fun to say, poka-yoke, which is the idea of building things so that it is impossible to use them incorrectly. It's a very elegant way of solving problems like security if you're able to design things that just work. So an example of Pokoyoki actually is an Ethernet cable or Cat5 cable, and that little finger on top makes it kind of impossible to put it in upside down, and people can kind of figure out how it works. And a 5-year-old could probably figure out how to put it in incorrectly, but the idea is designed for it. What's that? Till you break off the tail. Well, buy a new Cat5 cable, I'm sure would be their response to that. Well, okay, come on, guys. You guys are advanced breakers. This is the builder track. Come on now, give a girl a break. Okay, so wow, I came in under time. That is amazing. So to recap, operating systems effectively means using data and using tools that have existed for a while to make your lives easier as far as how you're going to design your systems, how you're going to manage them in an ongoing way, automation, and this idea that control systems can be optimized and you can predict what you should estimate what your performance is going to be and then figure out how you can manage to that. It will not just help you manage things consistently, which is something that I think that we all look for, but that creating that sort of feedback loop for yourself will also allow you to improve performance in pretty compelling ways. And of course, we did walk through building a model. I'm almost done. And I did show you numbers, right? I showed you some data. Okay, cool. So, one last clip art. And with that, any questions? Yes. What did the numbers mean? Hold on. Stop me when I get to the slide where you want me to explain something. This one. Okay. Yeah, there is a lot going on. Okay. Oh God. Okay. So, so this is the output of a. Am I late? Because they're sort of lining up. Are you getting ready? I got 4 minutes. Okay. Okay. So. So first I explained the variables. The dependent variable is the thing where we were testing, which is bad is true, and then there's the independent variables. And then when you sample and you run some of these algorithms against it, it will come up with some different tests, summary values, like the number of observations. And then it comes up with some different statistical tests to determine essentially if your experiment had significance. So I pretty much ignore those. I just want to make sure that they're in a healthy range. So the p-value is the significance of how likely this data really is to be able to help you predict some of these things. And then the pseudo R squared, well, it's variance. The variance in bad is true that is explained by these. So okay, let me go to odds ratio. So odds ratio is difficult for me. The coefficient is easier when you're doing a linear regression. It tells you that's what would be there instead of odds ratio. So the correlation coefficient tells you on average how much the dependent variable goes up with the presence of the independent variable. But because we're using logistic regression, they work with odds instead of correlation, and so it's actually a factor of the odds that the dependent variable will go up if the independent variable is incremented. And so, bad is true is yes or no. It goes between 0 and 1. That's one of the reasons why we're using a logistic regression, which is curvy, as opposed to a linear regression. And then standard error, z-score, and the confidence interval here, 95% of which these are the percentiles in which the values will end up. So I will be happy to follow up with you more on this later, but the truth is that I really just look to figure out what the significance of the variables are, and I basically just make sure that the p-value is good enough that it doesn't need to be thrown out. Cool. cool. Yeah. I have been considering going back and getting a PhD in economics, and that means I'll need to take probability and statistics for the third time around, so I have been kind of holding off on that. Other questions? I saw 2 hands, and we might have time for 2 more.
Question. We were talking about getting stakeholder buy-in on a lot of these things.
Yeah.
And you were talking about already having built the whole thing that's working. Are you using samples and building like a sample set?
So,
Showing them the model, like you're showing actual outcomes on those graphs, and you said you show them this, and you show them how much they're changing, and they automatically buy into it. But don't you need the buy-in before you build it usually?
well, sometimes you need buy-in before you build it. Sometimes you just start building it. Oh, well, in a lot of these security problems, basically, you just present, this is reality if we don't do anything, and they go, oh, please, do something. And so then you start rough, and then they come back and they go, oh my gosh, why is it having all of this impact that I wasn't expecting? And I say, well, let me help you with your expectations. We're going to do this and this and this, and this is probably what's going to happen. And as you collect more data, you can say things like, we're going to introduce this, which is an 85% hit rate or 15% false positive rate, and it's going to affect this many employees, customers, transactions, whatever. And the downside of doing this is that we will miss all of this that happened that is bad. So, you show them reasonableness to get up to speed, and then you get to the point where you can show them cool curves like that. And then saying to someone, let's invest so that we can shift the curve, that usually happens around budget time, and those are usually folks who just, want to understand what they're getting for their money if they do give you investment. And so you just show them how much improvement you're going to be giving them. Any other questions? None. Stunned silence. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming.